Okay. Have it? Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. And today, we are going to continue with our series on the Sermon on the Mount. And so just a few reminders to help us focus in today. This is our fifth message on our series so far, and you can find the other series on the website. So we have a learning, and then there's a tab called Sermon and Seminars, and we're starting to create a playlist for these because I think in the end there'll be a lot of them. So far we've covered the Ashrei of Messiah, otherwise known as the Beatitudes, and for those of you who are not involved yet, we're focusing our Havruta project right now on these verses. And so if you haven't started or don't have a pair and want to get started, you can still just kind of come in and start at the beginning, and we'll be at different places at the same time. See Joyce or I, and we can help you find a partner. We've been discussed how Yeshua's teaching on salt of the land and the light of the world roots us back to God's covenant of salt with Israel. And last week, we covered the tensions and controversies between first century Galilean Jews and the political religious elite in Judea, while we looked at Yeshua's words about the Torah. Remember, I come not to abolish, but to fill full. Now, this brings us back to climbing the winding path up the hill in Galilee. And at the top of the hill, if you can visualize this with me, is an open plain painted with tall, yellowed grass almost in seed, swaying gently in the fresh Galilean sea breeze. And Yeshua is teaching us from a spot near a rock by a single tree. And by now, thousands have gathered around him. His disciples have spread out through the crowds as repeaters, calling out his words for those further away. And after a long pause, Yeshua's voice cries out, "You have heard it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder.' And whoever commits murder shall be subject to judgment. And yet I tell you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be subject to judgment. And whoever says to his brother, 'Racha,' you shall be subject to the Sanhedrin. And whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be subject to the fires of Gehenna." We are in Matthew 5, verse 21 through 24. Bold words that have been repeated around the globe in every century since they were spoken. Now, I'm calling this message Torah from the inside out. Perhaps you've remembered, in the words of Amy Jill Levine, we have been calling the Sermon on the Mount the beginner's guide to the kingdom of heaven. And our goal in our series is to look at Yeshua's words in a Jewish way and come as close as we can to Yeshua's first hearers on the hills of Galilee. So today, let's unpack these famous verses and find another key to the kingdom of heaven in our midst. And we'll see that life in the kingdom of heaven begins from the inside out. To begin, we need to frame Yeshua's words with verses that lead into them. So we paraphrased these verses last week, and we unpacked this a lot more last week. But the way we paraphrase those verses is like this: I did not come to abolish, to end, to change the Torah in any way. Instead, I came to do the opposite, to establish the Torah, and more, to fill it full with meaning and to draw out its heart. Yeshua highlights the value of even the smallest commandments in the Torah in this passage. And surprisingly, he tells us that we must be even more righteous than the scribes and the Pharisees and the Torah scholars who prided themselves with being the most pious and were in fact using their authority to oppress the poor and the downtrodden within Israel. Yeshua was challenging the religious elite of Judea, and he's saying if you miss the heart behind the Torah, you'll miss the Torah's message of eternal life that is found nestled within. Elijah Zvi Soloveitchik, in his Jewish commentary on Matthew, connects this idea with a beautiful passage from the early rabbinic writings in Talmud. Everyone who follows the Torah but does not have fear of heaven, he is like a treasurer entrusted with the inner keys, but not the outer keys. How will he enter? The Torah and commandments, like murder, are likened to the inner keys in this parable, critical to life in the kingdom of heaven. But how can you get into the heart of Torah if you can't get through the outer door? The key to the outer door is the fear of heaven. Fear of heaven begins in your heart with faith. This Talmud muses on, woe to him who has no courtyard, but makes a gate in order to enter it. In other words, woe to the person who erects an outer wall of a courtyard, but has nothing inside. What's going on? Both parables are saying the same thing. Woe to the person who follows the commandments on the outside of the gate, but is not able to get into the heart. Yeshua is saying something similar to the religious elite of Judea of his day. They were far too often guilty of priding themselves on following the commandments around the outer wall, yet somehow they neglected the fear of heaven at the heart. We've seen earlier in our study that Yeshua flips the world's systems upside down. And similarly, when Yeshua says, you have heard it said, do not murder, yet I say to you, do not even be angry with your brother, he's giving us the first of many examples in the verses to come of how to find the keys through the outer walls and to enter into the inner room of the Torah, the keys to life in the kingdom of heaven from the inside out. So this is about murder and anger, but it has many layers as well, and many other things that he's beginning a whole argument, a whole message that's going to continue through the Sermon on the Mount with these verses. So let's unpack this verse, verse by verse, phrase by phrase, and see where we come out. You have heard the saying to those of old, you shall not murder. In Hebrew, the 10 Commandments are called the 10 devarim, the 10 words, the 10 sayings. So, of course, Yeshua, he's not just talking about a saying of old. He's taking us right back to the 10 Commandments spoken over Israel at Mount Sinai in days of old. Then Yeshua adds to the commandment from Exodus, and whoever commits murder shall be subject to judgment. Now, this is not from the 10 Commandments directly, but brilliantly roots the commandment even further back to Noah, just after the flood in Genesis 9. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image, God made humankind. He's linking us right back there. Yeshua connects murder to a violation of the created order of things. Humans are made in the divine image, and thus killing a man is desecrating the divine image. This creates a problem within the Torah, because murder is a capital offense. But once we see that the one doing the killing is also made in the divine image, more killing desecrates the divine image even more. And so within the Torah itself, this conflict is always something that we wrestle with. And there are all kinds of examples and reasons why capital punishment in the Torah might not be carried out. Moses committed murder, and he's not executed. Instead, he liberates Israel from slavery. King David commits murder in cold blood to cover his sin with Bathsheba, yet he's forgiven because of his contrite heart. And in Judaism, we have developed a complex legal system in the rabbinic period, which does everything it can to make capital punishment more and more difficult and harder to get to. So when Yeshua says the murderer is subject to judgment, he doesn't mean immediate death per se. The word for judgment, krise, refers more to a legal decision in a rabbinic court. This is even more clear when Yeshua explicitly refers to the Sanhedrin in the next verse. The Sanhedrin of Jerusalem was the great rabbinic assembly of 70 members, passed down from the 70 elders and Moses in the book of Numbers. Now, outside of Jerusalem, there were local districts that would have similar courts with 23 members, and it's a creative way of getting to 23 members. I won't unpack it now, but it's half to do the convicting and half to do murder with a half to do mercy and compassion with a tilt towards compassion. So the whole idea built into the Sanhedrin tradition is that we tilt towards compassion and mercy. The court was meant to preserve life, not to end life. Okay, now these courts would discuss the nuances and ins and outs of the Torah. And this is important because real life is always more complex and nuanced than when it is expressed in ideals and extremes, like we read in Genesis 9. Now, imagine the complex and diverse Jewish first century that we unpacked last week and all the different political tensions that were happening in the temple and with Rome and everything. So imagine that scene, and imagine the religious elite who were vying for political authority, abusing the system and using the gray areas of the court for their own gain, placing heavy burdens on the poor and the vulnerable that they were mandated to protect. As long as we don't actually kill, we've not transgressed. And if we do kill, there are ways to work around it. You see how this narrative goes. This happens in governments all the time. These leaders have fallen into the trap of the rabbinic parables that we just read. They have erected a large outer gate to their courtyard, but they can't access what's inside. They have been entrusted with the inner keys of the treasury, the seat of Moses, but they have lost the outer key. Yeshua uses a similar parable later in Matthew. You are whitewashed tombs, clean on the outside, but dead on the inside. Yeshua's lesson in his guide to life in the kingdom of heaven starts from the inside out. Now, back to our verse. So you've heard it said of old, do not murder. You'll be subject to the court's verdict. Yeshua continues, and yet I tell you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be subject to judgment. Now, remarkably, people in medieval times used this teaching as a justification to kill people as long as they didn't get angry. This was an extreme form of supersessionism like we talked about last time. Yeshua is the new Torah. He gets rid of the old, and this is new. And often that meant killing Jews in various different crusades. This is so ridiculous, I think it's almost not worth mentioning, except to say that in the Greek actually helps us understand the meaning in a Jewish context and draw this out. When Matthew records Yeshua saying, I come not to abolish the Torah, but to do the opposite, to establish it, the word for but is the strongest word he could use that negates what he just said. It can't mean end it. It must mean the opposite of end it. However, in this verse, Yeshua uses a different word, or Matthew records Yeshua using a different word, day. Day is softer and can mean and, or even moreover. And so I like to translate it, you have heard it said, and yet I say to you. Or we could also say, and even more I say to you. This kind of phrase is very familiar to the rabbis. The Talmud is filled with teachings that begin with Rabbi so-and-so says this, but Rabbi so-and-so says this, and Rabbi so-and-so says that. What's most striking is that when Yeshua comes in, he says, I say this to you. And this is how he establishes the Torah and the prophets on his own authority. Amy Jill Levine, in her commentary, writes that Yeshua is not neglecting the Torah or negating the Torah. He is extending the Torah. And Yeshua's extension does what Rabbinic Judaism calls building a fence around the Torah. We build a fence around the Torah so that it's harder to break what's inside. This is what Yeshua is doing. Rabbi Lapid writes, we all know from experience that homicide begins in the heart with hate or with disparagement of someone as a misanthrope, a parasite, or a vermin. It can begin at a desk or be drafted in an office. Because every murder begins in the heart. It is there that it must be nipped in the bud. And again, in rabbinic literature, we find another interesting parallel to Yeshua's teaching. He who tears his garment in anger, he who breaks his vessels in anger, he who scatters his money in anger, you shall regard as an idolater. For these are the tenets of the evil inclination. One day it tells him, do this, and the next day will tell him, do that, until it tells him, worship idols, and he will do so. So if anger can lead to idolatry, then hatred and murder are stepping stones along the way. Now there's an inside-out kind of progression in Yeshua's teaching. Murder begins with an angry orientation of the heart. In this context, Yeshua is not referring, I think, to anger generally as a static emotion or as a measured response to injustice. We'll talk about that another time. Remember, anger is simply a diagnostic tool to tell us that there's a problem, and anger can be good if used in that way. But I think here, Yeshua means targeting another person with anger. He says, I tell you, do not be angry with your brother. Targeting another person with your anger. This happens in the realms of angry feelings and thoughts, in our meditations of our minds, the things we think about and muse about. Once we target another person with our anger in our hearts, what happens next? Usually, we wield that anger with words. So too, Yeshua then moves from angry meditations in the heart to the next level, using words as weapons to wield anger. He continues, whoever says to his brother, Racha, shall be subject to the Sanhedrin. Whoever says, you fool, shall be subject to the fires of Gehenna. Inside anger directed towards a person, whether it's in the form of resentment or bitterness or envy or hate, if it's not dealt with well, it will come out. I had a mentor who used to say, your heart is showing when someone would despise another person with their words. Your heart is showing. Racha was an Aramaic term of contempt that was used in the first century and would have been known to everyone, and it means worthless, of no value. Yeshua's words precede another rabbinic saying in Talmud regarding the seriousness of calling people names. Anyone who humiliates his friend in public, it is as if he has shed blood and is guilty of Gehenna. This is in rabbinic writings, guilty of Gehenna. When his friend came in, his cheeks were red. When he left, they were white. To call someone worthless or a fool or stupid or an idiot, even if your words come out in the form of silent looks or in sighs, you have, in essence, broken the created order in a way very similar to murder. You have torn down a person, taken out their value. You've emptied them of the divine image. You've desecrated the divine image. Now, of course, we all know this phrase, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. It's a lie. And Yeshua tells us so. Words hurt, sometimes more than sticks and stones, and at times, words kill. Yeshua tells his first century hearers, now, this is what you should be discussing in the Sanhedrin. These are the things you should be discussing in the Sanhedrin to protect the Torah. And even more, and now I imagine that he becomes fearfully serious when he shares this with us. Even if this is not the case that the earthly court, and they don't take this up, it's not the case there. It will be true in the heavenly court, and you are at risk of the fires of Gehenna. Gehenna, or Gehinnom, is an actual place. In the Hebrew Bible, Gehinnom was associated with child sacrifice. in a few different places. In the first century, it was the garbage dump, a place for the corpses of people crucified by Rome, and dead animals and trash to be burned. The valley was a place of sewage, burning flesh and garbage. It made a compelling metaphor for the image of eternal fire and torment for those who do not enter eternal life. Now, I want to be clear, Yeshua is not saying that anger and that insults are equal to murder and thus equal to capital punishment, that there's no distinction between sins. I don't think that's what he's getting at all. Remember, in the Jewish court, even murder is not always a capital offense. And in the Torah, there are different kinds of murder, and there's an array of different judicial responses to murder. They're not all the same. How much more so here? Think of this as a kind of hyperbole. Yeshua is speaking to his followers, telling us how to live lives that follow him, and he is the heart of the Torah. Your righteousness must surpass that of the scribes, scholars, and Pharisees, vying for religious control and running the court system for their own benefit. Though they should be the authority of the Torah, in fact, they are missing the mark and so missing the way of eternal life. Moses set up the Sanhedrin to protect the inner room of the Torah, not to find ways to use it for your own gain. This is Yeshua's message. Really, it is when you first begin to feel the seeds of resentment or hate in your heart that you first step off the way of life in the kingdom of heaven. That's a message that is relevant to all of us today, and even more so in our age. This is where the battle lies. The kingdom of heaven does not begin by not killing. Not killing is rather the result of the kingdom of heaven already working within. Torah from the inside out. Now, the opposite of murder is life, and the opposite of anger is love. And just as anger nurtures murder, love nurtures life. Yeshua's Torah from the inside out begins in love and leads to life. Now, to close, we have fleshed out these verses in their context. And in the coming weeks, we'll look a bit more closely on how to manage anger and reconciliation and discover more of Yeshua's secret keys to the kingdom. But for now, let us join again the Amharetz and the thousands of Jews hanging on Yeshua's every word. The poor and the meek and the persecuted, they inherit the kingdom of heaven. They are the salt of God's covenant with Israel, the source of blessing for the nations of the world. Torah is established not on the authorities of the scribes and Pharisees and Torah scholars of the day, but on Yeshua's own authority given from his Father in heaven. And Yeshua begins to teach you what it means to live out a Jewish life centered around him. A kingdom of heaven kind of life, right now in your heart. And it is as if Yeshua's words, as you listen, come inside and probe your own soul. And you feel a slight sting as you remember various times when you've held on to resentment and anger toward another within your heart. And you think to yourself, oh, Rabbi Yeshua, what am I to do? After another pause, Yeshua continues as if answering your question. Here's what to do. If you're at the temple with your offering already on the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering right there and go right away. First to be reconciled to your brother, and then come and worship. We'll pick up with these verses next time. Shabbat shalom, everyone.